Alex never meant to spend the night in Blackwood Forest. Not alone anyway. The whole day trip had been planned down to the last detail. He'd marked spots on his map where the autumn colors would be at their peak. His camera batteries were fully charged, his hiking boots broken and just right, and he'd packed enough water and trail mix to last until sunset. The plan was simple. Capture the golden hour light filtering through the red and orange leaves, then drive back to his small apartment before dark. His friends often teased him about being too careful, too prepared. "You take the fun out of adventure," his buddy Tom had said last weekend over beers. But Alex just smiled and shrugged it off. At 32, he'd been taking photos in remote places long enough to know that nature didn't care about your plans. How right that thought turned out to be. The trouble started around 4 in the afternoon. Alex had hiked deeper into the forest than he'd originally intended, chasing the perfect shot of a hawk circling above a valley of flame-colored trees. By the time he checked his watch and turned back toward the parking area, the shadows had already grown long. Still plenty of time, he muttered to himself, adjusting his backpack and picking up his pace. The forest was quieter now, the birds settling in for the evening. He'd been to Blackwood many times before, but never this far from the main trails. Something about the quality of light here was different, richer somehow, making every photo he'd taken worth the extra hike. The first sign of trouble came when he reached his car. The old blue Subaru had never given him problems before, but when he turned the key, the engine made a horrible grinding noise. Then nothing. "You've got to be kidding me," Alex said, trying again. The same awful sound followed by silence. He popped the hood and stared at the engine, though he knew next to nothing about cars. Everything looked normal to his untrained eye. He tried the key once more, nothing but that sickening metallic grind. Alex pulled out his phone. No signal, not even a single bar, of course. The forest ranger station was closed for the season, and the nearest town, Pine Ridge, was a good 15 miles away. He looked at the sky. The sun was already dipping behind the mountains, painting the clouds pink and gold. Any other time, he would have been setting up his tripod to capture that light. Now it just meant he was running out of options. Alex weighed his choices. He could try walking to the main road, but that was at least 5 miles. And once darkness fell, the forest trails would be nearly impossible to navigate safely. Or he could make camp and wait until morning. Well, this wasn't the plan, he sighed, opening the trunk. Thankfully, he always kept emergency gear in his car, another habit his friends teased him about. Now he was grateful for his over-preparation as he pulled out a sleeping bag, a small tent, some protein bars, and a flashlight with extra batteries. As the last light faded from the sky, Alex had set up a modest camp about 50 yards from his car, in a small clearing surrounded by tall pines and maples. He'd chosen the spot carefully. Flat ground, no dead branches overhead that might fall during the night, and some shelter from the wind that had picked up as evening settled in. The night was clear, stars appearing one by one in the darkening sky. Under different circumstances, it would have been beautiful. Alex sat on a fallen log, eating a protein bar and sipping water from his bottle, trying to convince himself this was just an unexpected camping trip. The forest at night was a different world. During the day, Blackwood was all dappled light and birdsong, friendly and welcoming. Now as full darkness closed in, every sound seemed sharper, more mysterious. The wind through the trees sounded almost like whispers. Branches creaked. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called out. Alex wasn't exactly afraid, he'd camped alone plenty of times, but something felt different tonight. Maybe it was just the unexpectedness of it all, or being farther into the forest than he'd planned. Still, he couldn't shake a growing feeling of unease, like eyes watching from the darkness beyond his little camp. Just your imagination, he told himself, zipping up his jacket against the chill. Nothing out here but trees and deer and maybe a raccoon or two. As if to prove him wrong, a sound came from the thick undergrowth to his right. Not the light patter of small animals, but something heavier. Deliberate steps moving slowly through the brush. Alex froze, listening. The footsteps, if that's what they were, paused too, as if whatever made them was also listening. "Hello?" He called out, immediately regretting it. If it was a bear, calling attention to himself was the last thing he should do. But it didn't move like a bear. Bears weren't usually so careful. The footsteps resumed, circling around his camp but staying just beyond the reach of light from his small fire. Alex fumbled for his flashlight, clicked it on, and pointed it toward the sound. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating trees, ferns, the dense undergrowth. Nothing else. The footsteps had stopped. In fact, everything had stopped. The forest had gone completely unnaturally silent. No wind in the trees, no distant owl calls, no chirping insects. Nothing but the soft crackle of his small fire and the sound of his own breathing, suddenly too loud in his ears. Alex swept the flashlight in a slow arc around his camp. Trees brush, more trees. Nothing unusual, yet the silence persisted, pressing against his ears like a physical thing. Just an animal, he said aloud, his voice sounding strange in the quiet. Probably scared it off, but he didn't believe it. Whatever had been moving out there hadn't seemed scared at all. It had seemed purposeful. Alex added more wood to his fire, building it higher than he normally would. The dancing flames pushed back the darkness a few more feet, creating a larger circle of light. He told himself it was for warmth, but he knew better. Something about the forest tonight made him want as much light as possible. He checked his watch. Not even 9 o'clock. The night stretched ahead, long and dark. With nothing else to do, Alex reached for his camera. Photography always calmed him, and even if the shots were just firelight and shadows, it gave him something to focus on besides the unnatural silence and the memory of those deliberate footsteps. He was adjusting his settings when the sound came again. Closer this time. Twigs snapping underfoot, leaves rustling, and something else. A low sound that might have been breathing. Alex lowered his camera slowly, every muscle tense. The noise was coming from directly behind him now, just beyond the circle of firelight. He turned, moving carefully, and raised his flashlight again. The beam cut through the darkness, catching something, a flash of movement between two trees. Something tall, much taller than a person. Then it was gone, leaving only swaying branches in its wake. "Hey," Alex called out, his voice cracking slightly. "Who's there?" His only answer was the sudden return of forest sounds. The wind picking up again, rustling leaves, distant animal calls. The unnatural silence had broken as quickly as it had fallen. Alex stayed awake for a long time after that, feeding the fire, straining his eyes against the darkness. Every shadow seemed to move. Every sound made him jump. Eventually, exhaustion won out over fear, and he crawled into his tent, fully dressed, with his flashlight clutched in one hand. He didn't expect to sleep, but he must have dozed off because he woke suddenly, confused and disoriented. Something had pulled him from sleep. A sound, a feeling. He wasn't sure. The inside of the tent was pitch black. His flashlight had gone out. Alex fumbled for it, clicking the switch. Nothing happened. He tried again. Nothing. "Battery can't be dead," he whispered. He'd put in fresh ones just that morning. That's when he noticed the blue light. Faint but unmistakable. It seeped through the walls of his tent. A soft, pulsing glow that didn't look like firelight or flashlights or anything he could explain. And there were voices. Or something like voices, just on the edge of hearing. Whispers in the dark, speaking words he couldn't quite make out. Heart-pounding, Alex reached for his camera. Whatever was happening, he was going to document it. That thought, that need to record to make sense of the inexplicable, was the only thing keeping panic at bay. His finger found the shutter button just as a shadow fell across his tent. A tall, impossible shadow that shouldn't have been there with no light source behind it to cast. And Alex knew with absolute certainty that his night in Blackwood Forest was about to become something he could never have prepared for, no matter how careful his planning. Alex's hand trembled as he held his camera. The shadow looming over his tent hadn't moved. It just stood there, impossibly tall and still, like it was deciding what to do next. He couldn't hear breathing or movement, just those strange whispering voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. His fingers found the camera's record button by pure muscle memory. Even in his fear, the photographer in him couldn't let this moment go undocumented. Whatever was happening, he needed proof. Needed to know later that he hadn't imagined it all. The shadow suddenly pulled away, and the blue light grew stronger, pulsing with a rhythm that almost felt familiar, like a heartbeat but not quite. Alex held his breath. The whispering continued, rising and falling in patterns that sounded almost like conversation. "Come on," he whispered to himself. "Just look. You need to see." Gathering every bit of courage he had, Alex unzipped the tent flap just enough to peer out. The sight that greeted him made his mouth go dry. His campfire had died down to embers, but he didn't need it to see anymore. The forest around him was lit by dancing blue lights. Not the steady beam of flashlights or the warm flicker of fire, but something else entirely. They moved between the trees like fireflies, but much larger and with clear purpose. Some hovered in place while others traveled in perfectly straight lines or sudden right angles that no animal could make, and they were everywhere. Dozens of them, maybe more, scattered throughout the forest as far as he could see. "What the hell?" Alex breathed, raising his camera. Through the viewfinder, the lights looked even stranger, each surrounded by a halo that his eyes couldn't see directly. He hit record and slowly panned across the scene, trying to keep his hands steady despite his racing heart. That's when he noticed the clearing. About 50 yards from his tent, the blue light seemed to be gathering in a circle around an empty space. No, not empty. Something was happening there, something the lights were watching. Alex glanced at his watch. Just past midnight. He'd only been asleep for about 2 hours, but it felt like he'd entered another world entirely. The normal sounds of the forest had returned. Wind in the trees, distant animal calls, but they seemed to be background noise to the whispering voices that still filled the air. He reached for his flashlight again, shaking it, unsure why it had stopped working. To his surprise, it flickered to life, beam cutting through the darkness. Nothing seemed wrong with it. But when he pointed it toward the blue lights, something odd happened. They dimmed, almost like they were shrinking away from his light, but they didn't disappear. "They're real," he said quietly, "not just reflections or tricks of light." The scientist part of his brain, the part that wasn't frozen with fear, began forming theories. Bioluminescent fungi, some kind of electrical phenomenon, swamp gas. But none of those explanations made sense here, especially not with that whispering. Alex slipped on his boots and jacket, then hesitated at the tent entrance. Every instinct told him to stay put, to wait for morning. But the reporter in him, the part that had spent years chasing the perfect shot, the perfect story, wouldn't let him hide. He had to know. Moving as quietly as possible, he emerged from his tent. The night air felt different now, charged like the atmosphere before a storm. The blue lights continued their strange dance among the trees, seemingly uninterested in him. Several passed within a few feet of where he stood, casting his shadow in multiple directions at once. He raised his camera again, recording everything. The whispering grew louder as he moved toward the clearing where the lights had gathered. He couldn't understand the words, if they were words at all, but the cadence sounded almost like language, rising and falling in patterns that felt deliberate. About halfway to the clearing, Alex paused behind a large oak tree, suddenly uncertain. What if they weren't friendly? What if approaching them was dangerous? He'd come too far to turn back now, but caution finally overcame curiosity. Instead of walking directly into the clearing, he decided to circle around, staying within the tree line where shadows would help hide him. He'd get close enough to see, to record, but not so close that he'd be easily spotted. The path around was rougher than he expected, full of thorny undergrowth and fallen branches that seemed determined to trip him. Every step had to be carefully placed to avoid making noise. Despite the cool night air, sweat beaded on his forehead from concentration and fear. As he drew closer to the clearing, the whispers changed. They became more urgent, more rhythmic. Some part of Alex's mind, a part he wasn't fully aware of, began to pick up patterns in the sounds. Not words exactly, but impressions, curiosity, excitement, purpose. He found a good vantage point behind a thick cluster of pine trees, just at the edge of the clearing. From here, he could see everything without being too exposed. He raised his camera and began to record. The clearing wasn't natural. That much was immediately obvious. A perfect circle about 30 feet across, with no stumps or signs of cutting. Just a clean, empty space where trees should have been. The blue lights hovered around its perimeter, more numerous here than anywhere else in the forest. They seemed to be waiting for something. Alex zoomed in with his camera, sweeping slowly around the clearing's edge. That's when he saw them, the figures standing among the trees. At first he thought they were just shadows or tricks of light, but as his eyes adjusted, he realized they were solid. People, he thought at first, but no, not people at all. They stood perfectly still, unnaturally thin and tall. 7 feet at least, maybe more. Their forms were dark against the trees, absorbing the blue light rather than reflecting it. He couldn't make out faces or features from this distance, just elongated silhouettes that remained completely motionless. Alex's breath caught in his throat. His finger hovered over the camera's zoom button, wanting to get a closer look but terrified of what he might see. Before he could decide, the whispering suddenly stopped. All of it all at once, leaving the forest in eerie silence. Even the wind seemed to die down. The blue lights froze in place, no longer dancing but hovering, waiting. Something was coming. Alex could feel it in the air, in the stillness that had fallen over everything. The tall figures around the clearing's edge seemed to straighten, their attention focused on the circle's center. A single blue light, brighter than the others, descended slowly from above the trees. It moved with deliberate grace, floating down until it hovered about 7 feet above the center of the clearing. Then it began to expand, growing larger and brighter until it illuminated the entire space with a cold blue glow. Within that light, something began to take shape, a form even taller than the others, its proportions strange and unsettling. Alex couldn't look away. His camera recorded everything, though he'd forgotten he was even holding it. All he could do was watch as the figure in the light solidified. It raised what might have been arms, long and jointed in too many places. The whispering started again, but different now. A single voice, deep and resonant, speaking in that same incomprehensible language. The figures around the edge of the clearing responded, their whispers rising and falling like a chant or prayer. Alex's heart pounded so hard he was certain they must hear it. His mouth had gone dry, his palms sweaty around the camera. Part of him wanted to run, to get as far from this place as possible. But another part, the part that had always pushed him to explore, to discover, kept him rooted to the spot. The tall figure in the center of the clearing lowered its arms, and the blue light surrounding it dimmed slightly. It turned slowly as if surveying the gathered figures. Then, with movements that seemed both fluid and mechanical at the same time, it knelt down and began to examine the ground. Alex zoomed in as far as his camera would allow. The figure appeared to be collecting something from the forest floor, small objects that glinted in the blue light. It placed these items in what looked like a container of some sort, though unlike any container Alex had ever seen. The whispering continued, rising and falling in intensity. Some of the tall figures around the edge of the clearing had begun to move, swaying slightly as if in response to the central figure's actions. The blue lights danced more actively now, swooping and circling above the gathering. Lost in the strange spectacle, Alex leaned forward for a better view. His weight shifted, and a dry branch beneath his foot snapped with a crack that seemed deafening in the hushed forest. Every head in the clearing turned toward him simultaneously. Every blue light froze in place. The whispering cut off mid-syllable. They had heard him. Alex's blood turned to ice. For one horrible moment he couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then panic took over. He stumbled backward, nearly dropping his camera, and turned to run. The forest that had been so carefully navigated on his approach now seemed to work against him. Branches caught at his clothes, roots threatened to trip him, thorns tore at his skin. Behind him he heard movement, not the crashing pursuit he expected, but something more deliberate. Careful steps following his path. His flashlight beam bounced wildly as he ran, illuminating trees and undergrowth in chaotic flashes. The blue lights appeared ahead of him now, no longer just behind. They were cutting him off, directing his flight. "Leave me alone," he shouted, veering sharply to the right away from the lights. His voice sounded thin and frightened in the darkness. Something brushed against his shoulder, a touch so light he might have imagined it, except for the jolt of cold that shot through his body at the contact. He ran faster, gasping for breath, driven by pure instinct now. Ahead he spotted his tent and the dying embers of his campfire, safety, or at least the illusion of it. He sprinted the last few yards, practically diving through the tent flap and zipping it closed behind him. Inside, curled in his sleeping bag, Alex clutched his camera to his chest like a talisman. His heart pounded, his breath came in ragged gasps. Outside, he could hear them moving around his camp, soft footsteps and those constant whispering voices. The blue lights seeped through the tent walls again, circling slowly, curiously. Shadows passed back and forth, tall, impossible shadows that no human could cast. Alex checked his camera with trembling hands, praying he'd captured it all. The screen glowed to life, showing the recording was still running. He documented everything. As the night deepened around him, Alex knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever he'd witnessed in that clearing, whatever was moving outside his tent right now, it wasn't from this world. And somehow he'd have to survive until morning. Alex lay awake in his tent for what felt like hours, listening to the movements outside. The whispers had grown quieter but hadn't stopped completely. The blue light still danced across the tent walls, casting strange shadows that moved in ways shadows shouldn't. His watch read 3:17 a.m., still hours until dawn. He checked his camera again, rewinding the footage to watch what he'd captured. The screen showed the clearing, the lights, the tall figures, all of it real, not just his imagination. He paused on a frame that showed the central figure kneeling, collecting something from the ground. Zooming in as much as the camera would allow, he could just make out what looked like small glowing stones or crystals being gathered into some kind of container. What were they? And why were these beings collecting them? A sudden silence fell outside. The whispers stopped. The blue lights dimmed. Alex held his breath, straining to hear. Nothing. Had they left? Or were they just waiting? Despite every survival instinct screaming at him to stay put, Alex knew he couldn't just hide until morning. Whatever was happening in that forest, it was something no one had documented before. He might never get another chance like this. If he could just get closer, get better footage. This is how people die in horror movies, he muttered to himself. But he was already pulling on his boots again. This time, he left his flashlight off. The blue lights provided enough illumination to see by, and he didn't want to announce his presence any more than necessary. Moving as quietly as possible, he unzipped the tent just enough to peer out. The camp appeared empty. No tall figures, no blue lights nearby, just the normal darkness of the forest and the faint glow coming from the direction of the clearing. Alex slipped out, camera in hand, and stood perfectly still, listening. The forest sounds had returned. Crickets chirping, an occasional rustle in the underbrush, the soft hoot of an owl. Normal sounds that somehow made him more uneasy after the unnatural silence. The glow from the clearing seemed stronger now, pulsing with that same almost familiar rhythm. The whispers had started again too, but fainter, more distant. They were still there, still doing whatever they were doing. He had to see more. Moving from tree to tree, using each as cover, Alex made his way back toward the clearing. He chose a different approach this time, more careful with his footing, testing each step before putting his weight down. No more broken branches to give him away. As he drew closer, the blue glow intensified. The whispers grew louder, more distinct. He still couldn't understand the words, but the cadence seemed more urgent now, more purposeful. He found a new vantage point behind a large boulder and a fallen tree, offering both cover and a clear view of the clearing. Settling in, he raised his camera and began recording again. The scene had changed. The tall figures were arranged in a perfect circle now, facing inward. The blue lights hovered above them, pulsing in sync. In the center of the clearing, where the tall figure had been kneeling before, something new had appeared, a pattern etched into the ground, glowing with the same blue light. It looked like a map or diagram of some kind, with lines connecting various points in patterns too complex for Alex to make sense of. Some parts of it shifted and moved, changing configuration even as he watched. The tall figures seemed to be studying it, occasionally reaching out with their long, strangely jointed arms to touch specific points. The central figure, taller than the rest and somehow more substantial, moved around the pattern, making adjustments. Each time it touched the glowing lines, they rippled and changed, sending pulses of brighter light through the entire design. Alex zoomed in, trying to capture every detail. This wasn't just some strange gathering in the woods. This was, a meeting? A ritual? Some kind of scientific study? None of the explanations his mind offered seemed to fit what he was seeing. One of the figures broke from the circle and moved to the edge of the clearing, stopping at what looked like a pile of equipment. It bent down, retrieving something long and thin that glinted in the blue light. A tool of some kind, or maybe a weapon. Alex couldn't tell from this distance. The figure returned to the circle, handing the object to the central being. It took it with oddly graceful movements and turned toward the center of the pattern. The whispers grew louder, more rhythmic, almost like a chant. The central figure raised the object high above the pattern. The blue light swirled faster, drawing closer. The pattern on the ground pulsed brighter, its lines shifting more rapidly. Something was about to happen. Alex felt it in the charged air, in the way the whispers had taken on an almost excited quality. He pressed the zoom button again, trying to get a clearer view of what the figure was doing. His finger slipped in his excitement, hitting the photo button instead. The camera's flash went off. A sudden blinding burst of light in the darkness. Everything stopped. The whispers cut off mid-syllable. The blue lights froze in place. Every figure in the clearing turned as one, facing directly toward his hiding spot. "No, no, no," Alex whispered, fumbling with the camera, trying to turn off the flash setting he never meant to use. But it was too late. The damage was done. For one terrible moment, nothing moved. Alex pressed himself lower behind the fallen tree, heart pounding so hard he was sure they must hear it. Maybe they hadn't seen exactly where he was. Maybe they were just reacting to the light, not to him specifically. Then the central figure lowered its arm and took a step toward him. The others followed, moving with that same unsettling grace, too fluid, too coordinated. The blue lights drifted in his direction, slowly at first, then faster. Alex didn't wait to see more. He turned and ran, no longer caring about stealth, driven by pure panic. Branches whipped his face. Roots threatened to trip him, but he kept going, crashing through the underbrush like a frightened deer. Behind him, he heard them coming, not running or crashing through the forest as he was, but moving quickly, purposefully. The blue lights appeared ahead of him, cutting him off. He veered left, then right, changing direction frantically, but they were everywhere now, surrounding him. His foot caught on something, a root or stone, and he fell hard, sprawling on the forest floor. His camera flew from his hand, landing somewhere in the darkness beyond reach. He scrambled to his hands and knees, gasping for breath, looking wildly around. Blue light circled him, drawing closer. Tall shadows moved between the trees, converging on his position. The whispers had changed tone, becoming lower, almost cautious. "Stay back," he shouted, though he knew it was pointless. Whatever these beings were, they probably couldn't understand him any more than he could understand them. He stumbled to his feet, looking desperately for an escape route. There, a gap between the lights, a darker patch of forest. Without hesitation, he lunged toward it, running blind, driven by instinct. The forest seemed to shift around him, trees appearing where none had been before, paths disappearing as soon as he found them. Or maybe it was just panic, confusing his sense of direction. Either way, he was lost, with no idea which way led back to his camp or to the road. He kept running until his lungs burned and his legs threatened to give out. Finally, he stopped, leaning against a tree, gasping for breath. The forest around him was quiet again. No blue lights, no whispers, no tall figures moving through the trees. Had he lost them? Or had they simply let him go? Alex looked around, trying to get his bearings. Nothing looked familiar. The trees here were older, larger, their branches forming a thick canopy overhead that blocked out most of the starlight. The air felt different too, heavier somehow, with a faint scent he couldn't identify. He turned slowly in a circle, searching for any landmark that might help orient him. That's when he saw it, another clearing smaller than the first, perfectly circular, like it had been precisely cut from the forest. In its center stood a single massive tree unlike any he'd ever seen before. Its trunk was pale, almost white, and seemed to give off a faint luminescence in the darkness. Its branches spread out in all directions, perfectly balanced, with leaves that shimmered slightly despite the lack of wind. Alex approached cautiously, drawn by a curiosity he couldn't explain. Something about the tree seemed ancient, important. As he drew closer, he noticed markings on its trunk, symbols carved into the bark in patterns similar to the glowing design he'd seen in the other clearing. He reached out, hesitating just before his fingers touched the trunk. Should he? What if it was dangerous? But before he could decide, a soft blue glow began to emanate from the symbols. They lit up one by one, spreading across the trunk in rippling waves. The tree itself seemed to pulse with light, like it was waking up, becoming aware of his presence. The ground beneath his feet vibrated slightly. The air grew warmer, and from somewhere deep in the forest came the whispers again. Drawing closer, they had found him. Alex backed away from the tree, its symbol still glowing, lighting up the small clearing with that eerie blue light. He turned to run again, but stopped short. They were already there. Tall figures stood at the edge of the clearing, perfectly still, watching him. Blue lights hovered above them, casting their elongated shadows across the ground toward him. Their whispers filled the air, rising and falling in patterns that almost made sense now, as if his brain was beginning to recognize the structure of their language. The central figure, taller than the rest, stepped forward into the clearing. In one hand, it held something that glinted in the blue light. His camera, retrieved from where he'd dropped it. It extended the camera toward him, not as a threat, but as an offering. A gesture that seemed almost curious. Alex stood frozen, uncertain. Was this a trap, or was it trying to communicate, to understand why he had been watching them? Slowly, hesitantly, he reached out to take the camera. As his fingers closed around it, they briefly touched the figure's hand, if hand was even the right word for the long, pale appendage with too many joints. A jolt like static electricity passed between them, and suddenly, impossibly, one of the whispers resolved into a word he could understand. Observer, it seemed to say, the sound forming not in his ears but directly in his mind. And Alex knew with absolute certainty that his life would never be the same again. That single word, observer, echoed in Alex's mind as he stood frozen, camera in hand, facing the tall being. Around them, the blue lights pulsed and danced, casting shifting shadows across the clearing. The white tree behind him continued to glow, its carved symbols bright against the dark forest. The being tilted its head, a motion that seemed almost human despite its impossible height and strange proportions. The whispers around them grew quieter, as if the others were waiting, watching. "You understand me?" Alex managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. No verbal response came, but another thought formed in his mind. Not his own, but placed there somehow. Not exactly words, more like impressions, feelings, images that his brain struggled to translate. Watching, recording, why? Alex swallowed hard, uncertain if he should answer or run. But curiosity, the same curiosity that had gotten him into this situation, won out over fear. "I'm just documenting, learning," he said, holding up his camera slightly. "That's what I do. I record things, beautiful things, interesting things." He hesitated, then added, "new things." The being remained motionless for several seconds. Then it raised one long arm, pointing at the camera, then at its own face, or where a face would be on a human. Its features were difficult to make out, shadowed despite the blue light all around them. Alex understood. Slowly, hands trembling slightly, he raised the camera and switched it to preview mode. He turned the screen toward the being, showing the footage he'd captured of their gathering. The glowing pattern on the ground, the ritual or whatever it had been. The being leaned closer, examining the images. The whispers around them grew excited, rising and falling in quick patterns. Several of the other tall figures moved forward, gathering around to see. Something like approval or satisfaction flowed into Alex's mind. Not words again, but a feeling. A sense that they were pleased with what he had recorded. Then, without warning, one of the beings reached out and touched the camera. A spark of blue energy passed from its long fingers into the device. The screen flickered, went black, then lit up again, but now showing images Alex hadn't recorded. Strange landscapes under unfamiliar stars. Structures that defied physics. Beings like these, but in what appeared to be their own environment. "What are you doing?" Alex asked, alarmed but fascinated. "What is this?" "Exchange," came the impression in his mind. "You observe us. We observe you." The central being, the tallest one, stepped back and made a gesture toward the forest. The others moved aside, creating a path between the trees. Blue lights floated ahead, illuminating the way. Alex hesitated. Were they letting him go, or leading him somewhere? Before he could decide, more impressions flowed into his mind. Not from the tall being this time, but from the glowing tree behind him. Ancient awareness. Patient waiting. Recognition. He turned to look at the tree again. Its symbols pulsed with light, almost like it was breathing. One of the carved patterns near eye level caught his attention. A spiral with small marks along its curves. It looked strangely like a map of the solar system, though not quite right. Some planets were missing. Others added where none should be. The tall being touched his shoulder lightly, a touch that sent a cold shiver through his body, and pointed down the illuminated path. Alex got the message. It was time to go. But go where? With no better options, he started walking in the direction indicated. The tall beings fell into step around him, not threatening, but escorting. The blue lights drifted ahead, lighting the way through the dark forest. They walked in silence for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The forest around them seemed to shift and change. Trees moved aside, Paths appeared where none had been before. Alex tried to keep track of their direction, but soon gave up. Nothing made sense anymore. It was as if the forest itself was rearranging around them. He checked his watch. 4:23 a.m., still dark, but dawn would come eventually. If he could just make it until morning. The path widened, and suddenly they were at the edge of a small pond Alex didn't remember seeing before. Its surface was perfectly still, reflecting the blue lights and the stars above like a mirror. The tall being stopped, forming a half-circle behind him. "What now?" Alex asked, looking at the water, then back at the beings. The tallest one gestured toward the pond. An impression formed in Alex's mind. Look closer. He stepped to the edge of the water and peered down. His own reflection stared back at him, illuminated by the blue lights hovering overhead. But as he watched, the reflection changed. The water's surface rippled slightly, though there was no wind, and suddenly he wasn't alone in the reflection. Behind his image stood the tall beings, just as they stood behind him in reality. But in the reflection, he could see them clearly for the first time. Their forms were sleek, their limbs long and graceful. Their faces, if you could call them faces, had no features he recognized, just patterns of light that shifted and changed like the symbols on the white tree. But that wasn't all. In the reflection, more figures appeared, smaller ones, human-sized, with familiar shapes. People, dozens of them, standing among the tall beings as if they belonged there. Alex spun around, looking behind him. Only the tall beings were there, no humans. When he turned back to the pond, the reflection still showed both, the tall beings and the human figures side by side. "Who are they?" he asked, pointing at the reflection. "The people. Where are they?" A complex series of impressions flowed into his mind. Images of people entering the forest at night just as he had. Encounters with the blue lights, the tall beings. Some running away in fear, others staying, communicating, learning. Others like you, came the clearest impression. Observers, some stay, some go. Alex's blood ran cold. "Stay? You mean—" "They're still here, in the forest?" The tallest being made a gesture that wasn't quite a nod but conveyed agreement. More impressions flowed, people choosing to remain, to learn, to exchange knowledge. Not prisoners, but not entirely free to leave either, bound somehow to the forest, to the white tree, to whatever these beings were doing here. "And the ones who go?" Alex asked, dreading the answer. The being pointed to Alex's camera, still clutched tightly in his hand. Then to his head, to his heart, changed, came the impression. Not physically, perhaps, but altered nonetheless. Carrying something back with them. Knowledge, awareness, maybe even something more tangible. Alex took a step back from the pond, from the beings. "I want to go," he said firmly. "Back to my camp. Back to my car. I want to leave the forest." The beings made no move to stop him, but the blue light swirled more actively and the whispers grew louder. The tallest one approached the pond and touched the surface with one long finger. The water rippled and the reflection changed again. Now it showed Alex's car, parked where he'd left it on the forest road. But something was different. In the reflection, the car was in perfect condition, not broken down as he knew it to be. "You fixed my car?" he asked, disbelieving. No direct answer came, just another impression. Time to choose. Stay and learn more, or go, carrying what he'd already seen and experienced. Alex didn't hesitate. "I want to go," he repeated. "Please." The tallest being made another gesture, and the blue lights formed a path leading away from the pond, deeper into the forest. The being pointed along this path, then at the lightening sky visible through the trees. Dawn was approaching, the message was clear. Follow the lights and he would find his way back. Alex looked down at his camera, at the strange images it now contained alongside his own recordings. Evidence of something incredible, something no one would believe. He looked back at the beings, at the pond with its impossible reflections, at the forest that seemed to shift and change around them. "Will I ever understand what happened here?" he asked. The impression that formed in response was complex, a sense of cycles, of returns, of patterns repeating. Not a yes or a no, but something more ambiguous. "We will observe," was the clearest thought that came through. "As you observe." With that, the beings began to step back, fading into the shadows between the trees. The blue lights remained, marking the path he was meant to follow. The whispers grew fainter. Alex took one last look at the pond, at the reflections that had already begun to fade back to normal. Then he turned and started walking along the path of blue lights, moving as quickly as he dared through the pre-dawn forest. The path twisted and turned, making no logical sense, yet somehow always leading forward. The blue light stayed just ahead, guiding him. Occasionally, he heard whispers from the darkness between the trees, or caught glimpses of tall figures watching from a distance. But none approached him now. After what seemed like hours of walking, though his watch showed only 30 minutes had passed, the trees began to thin. The blue lights grew fainter as the sky lightened, and suddenly, there it was, the forest road, and parked alongside it, his car. Alex approached cautiously, half expecting the car to disappear like some kind of mirage. But it remained solid, real. He tried the door. It opened. Inside, everything looked normal, except for a small, smooth object on the driver's seat that hadn't been there before. It was about the size of a pebble, but perfectly round and slightly translucent, with a faint blue glow that pulsed like the lights in the forest. When he picked it up, it felt warm against his skin and seemed to vibrate slightly, as if responding to his touch. A final gift. A tracking device? A reminder? He couldn't tell. Alex slipped the strange object into his pocket, then tried the car's ignition with little hope it would start. The engine turned over immediately, purring like it had never been broken. As the sun's first rays broke over the distant mountains, Alex pulled away from Blackwood Forest, the strange blue object warm in his pocket, his camera full of impossible images, and his mind racing with questions that would keep him awake for many nights to come. Behind him, in the forest's deepening shadows, blue lights winked out one by one and whispers faded to silence. But the sense of being watched, observed, stayed with him long after the trees had disappeared from his rearview mirror. 3 months had passed since that night in Blackwood Forest. But for Alex, it might as well have been yesterday. The memories remained crystal clear. The blue lights, the tall beings, the whispers that somehow formed thoughts in his mind. Most nights he still woke up in a cold sweat, certain he could see blue light seeping under his bedroom door. His apartment had become something between a sanctuary and a prison. The walls were covered with printouts of the images from his camera, both the ones he'd taken himself and the strange ones that had appeared after the tall being touched it. He'd organized them by type: the clearing, the white tree, the beings themselves, and the alien landscapes that still made no sense to him. In the center of his living room stood a corkboard covered with news articles and reports. Missing persons cases from areas surrounding Blackwood Forest going back decades. Weather anomalies. Unexplained lights seen by hikers and campers. He'd connected them with red string, trying to find patterns, trying to make sense of what had happened to him. The small blue object sat on his desk in a glass case he'd bought specially for it. It still glowed faintly, still pulsed with that almost familiar rhythm. Sometimes when he was alone at night, he would take it out and hold it, feeling that slight vibration against his palm. In those moments, impressions would form in his mind. Nothing as clear as during his encounter in the forest, but hints, suggestions, watching, waiting, returning. Alex hadn't shown anyone the full collection of photos and videos from that night. How could he? Who would believe him? They'd say the images were doctored, the footage fake. They'd call him crazy or attention-seeking. He'd seen enough UFO documentaries to know how these stories ended for the people who told them. But he hadn't kept it entirely to himself either. 2 weeks after his experience, he'd reached out to a professor of astronomy he'd once interviewed for a magazine article. The man had a reputation for being open-minded about the possibility of extraterrestrial life. Alex had shown him a carefully selected handful of photos, nothing too outlandish, just enough to gauge the reaction. The professor had studied the images for a long time, asking detailed questions about where and when they were taken. Then he'd handed them back with a warning. Be careful who you share these with. There are people who would go to great lengths to possess evidence like this. He'd declined to elaborate, but his expression had been serious enough that Alex took the warning to heart. A month later, he'd contacted a sound engineer he knew, someone who worked on analyzing audio for criminal cases. He'd given her the recording of the whispers, saying only that he'd captured it in the forest and was curious about what might be in it. Her analysis had been frustrating and fascinating in equal measure. This isn't any language I've ever heard, she'd told him, and I'm not convinced it's language at all. The patterns are too regular, too structured. almost like code or music. But here's the weird thing, it's not manufactured. Whatever made these sounds, it wasn't electronic or digitally created. These are organic sounds. Alex had thanked her and left quickly before she could ask too many questions. Since then, he'd kept the evidence to himself, uncertain what to do with it. He'd gone back to his regular job, editing photographs for a nature magazine, but his heart wasn't in it anymore. How could he care about perfectly composed shots of sunsets or eagles when he had images of beings from another world, or another dimension, or whatever they were, sitting on his hard drive? He'd tried to research Blackwood Forest to see if others had reported similar experiences there. The results were sparse but suggestive. A group of hikers in the 1970s who claimed to have seen glowing figures among the trees. A forest ranger who quit his job after 20 years, refusing to explain why except to say that the forest isn't what we think it is. A local legend about a spirit tree that could show you visions if you found it on a moonless night. None of it was conclusive, but it was enough to convince Alex that he wasn't the first to encounter the beings, and judging by the reflections he'd seen in that pond, he was far from the only one. The strangest thing, though, had happened just last week. He'd received a plain envelope in the mail with no return address. Inside was his driver's license, which he hadn't even realized was missing. He always kept it in his wallet, and his wallet had been with him the whole time. At least he thought it had. The license was unchanged except for one small detail, a tiny blue dot in the corner that glowed faintly when the lights were out. The same blue as the lights in the forest, the same blue as the small object they had left in his car. The message was clear. They knew who he was. They knew where he lived. And they were still watching. That night, unable to sleep, Alex had taken the blue object from its case and sat with it in the dark, letting the soft glow illuminate his fingers. As he held it, impressions began to form in his mind, stronger than before. Not just feelings this time, but almost words. Return. Soon. Chosen. He'd nearly dropped the object in surprise. The beings were communicating with him, across whatever distance separated them. The object wasn't just a souvenir or a marker. It was a link, a connection. The next morning, he'd checked the local news as he did every day, searching for any stories that might relate to Blackwood Forest or the beings. There was a small item that caught his attention. 3 hikers had gone missing in the forest over the weekend. The search was ongoing, but authorities were baffled by the lack of any traces. Alex had stared at the screen for a long time, thinking about the reflections in the pond. The human figures standing among the tall beings. Some stay, some go. Had these hikers encountered the same beings? Were they given the same choice he had been? He'd spent the day researching missing persons cases in and around Blackwood Forest, going back as far as he could find records. The pattern was disturbing. Every few years there was a cluster of disappearances, usually 3 or 4 people within a short time period. The cases were rarely solved. Those few who were found often couldn't account for their time in the forest, describing lost hours or even days. But the most troubling discovery came when he tried to go back and review these cases again the next day. Several of the articles he'd found had disappeared from the news archives. Searches that had yielded dozens of results now showed nothing. It was as if someone or something was systematically erasing these records. Now, as he sat in his apartment 3 months after his encounter, Alex faced a decision. The blue object on his desk pulsed more intensely than ever before. The impressions it sent to his mind had become more frequent, more insistent. Return. Time. Cycle. He knew what it meant. The beings wanted him to come back to the forest. But why? What would happen if he did? Would he be given the choice to stay again? Or was there something else they wanted from him? His phone chimed with a news alert. He'd set it to notify him of any stories about Blackwood Forest. This one made his blood run cold. Forest Service announces temporary closure of Blackwood Forest due to unexplained environmental phenomena. The article described unusual light patterns observed by satellite, unexplained radiation readings, and strange behavior in local wildlife. The forest would be closed to the public while experts investigated. A team of scientists was being assembled.